Despite his great importance for Egypt, few people know the story of Pharaoh Narmer. Narmer was a great warrior and military leader, responsible for unifying two rival territories, thus creating the world's first great political state, Egypt. After this feat, Narmer became pharaoh, the first in history. To better understand the history and importance of Pharaoh Narmer, we first need to understand the context of the time in which he lived. So I will briefly summarize the geopolitics of the region that is now known as Egypt. Around 3100 BC, the place that would come to be known as the Empire of Egypt was nothing more than a wild and chaotic landscape. The region was inhabited by numerous tribes who settled along the banks of the Nile River and often came into conflict with each other. These tribes were called nomos. Each had its own ruler, and they fought every day for their survival. Wars and small conflicts were constant. Egypt was practically a lawless land. Subsequently, several tribes unified and formed two dominant groups in the region. One group was in Upper Egypt, further south of the Nile River, and the other group was in Lower Egypt, to the north in the Nile Delta region. The two groups were deadly rivals and were constantly at war. Upper Egypt, with its arid and mountainous lands, versus Lower Egypt, with its fertile plains and access to the Mediterranean. These two groups had distinct cultures. Their clothing, traditions, and even the crowns of their monarchs were different. Southern rulers had tall white crowns, known as hedjet, and northern rulers had shallow red crowns, called deshert. Various engravings on ceramics and representations of leaders from each kingdom and their traditions show the differences between the two peoples. In the midst of this, between the conflicts of the kingdom of Upper and Lower Egypt, Narmer appears. Narmer was the monarch of Upper Egypt and had a great ambition, the unification of Egypt into a single kingdom. Narmer used his strength, cunning, and strategy to reach his objective. There is still no consensus among historians regarding all of Narmer's achievements to unify Egypt. Some theorize that it was through military campaigns, while others say that it was through marriage. Regardless of what happened, Narmer faced several challenges, especially since the two peoples had their own lifestyle and traditions. There were some rebellions that were quickly contained. By incorporating the fertile region of Lower Egypt into his territory, Narmer created a united Egypt, thus giving rise to the first great state in the world. The union of these two lands marked not only the beginning of a political state, but it was also the ground zero of a great cultural state that changed the history of humanity. From this unification, Egypt developed a unique visual style in the age of pharaohs, whose influence reverberated over time. The iconography, symbols, and writing adopted by leaders like Narmer and also his successors became tools used by all pharaohs in history to convey power, strength, and unity over several millennia. But incredible as it may seem, very little is known about Pharaoh Narmer. In historical records, the reading and meaning of his name are still uncertain. It is only known that his name is present throughout Egypt, indicating that Narmer may have been the first king to rule the entire region. Furthermore, his name was also found outside of Egypt, in the region that today belongs to Syria and Palestine, which makes it clear that Narmer traded with these regions. In addition to these signs in other places, there is also a great indication of the greatness of Pharaoh Narmer. The famous Narmer palette is evidence of this. It is like a film carved in stone and shows different scenes of war, victories, and mysterious symbols that still intrigue historians. And another great source of information about this king is the Palermo stone, a slab of black granite engraved with the names of the kings of Egypt up to the 5th dynasty. In addition to the records of the kings, it also includes details of the annual harvests, festivals, wars, and also the most important buildings in Egypt. Unfortunately, only a few fragments have survived the test of time and are kept in Palermo, Nucario, and London, and the part of the stone that mentions the first king of the first dynasty was lost, as well as that of his successor. Even without this historical proof, historians believe that Narmer was the first king of Egypt, and he would have been followed by the pharaoh Atotis. Although many Egyptologists agree that Narmer founded the first dynasty, the issue continues to be debated, as the absence of definitive evidence prevents a final conclusion. There are other impasses regarding his name as well. The ancient Greeks referred to him as Menes. However, there is no consensus that Menes and Narmer were the same person, and the academic community is to this day divided on this issue. The Greek historian Herodotus visited Egypt around 445 BC, and he ended up recording the names of several Egyptian kings, including Menes, as being the first of these kings. However, there is no mention of Narmer in their accounts, leading to the assumption that Narmer and Menes were one person. But the big problem with this story is that Herodotus visited Egypt centuries after Narmer lived, during the late period, and Egyptian lighthouses often adopted several names throughout their lives. This further complicates the precise identification of Narmer and his correlation with the name Menes. On the other hand, another historian, this one a little more recent, called Flinders Petrie, who was a renowned Egyptologist, argued that Narmer and Menes were two different names for the same person. Narmer would be his birth name, while Menes would be a title of honor. A Greek priest who was born in Egypt called Manetau wrote the Egyptian, or as it is better known, the History of Egypt. In this work, he categorically states that Menes was the first Egyptian pharaoh, and largely responsible for the unification of Egypt around 3100 BC. But whether these two names are the same person or not, the fact is that Narmer became an emblematic figure in the history of Egypt. According to the accounts of Herodotus and Manetau, Narmer was described as an experienced military commander who was loved by his soldiers. Therefore, he achieved the feat of unifying Egypt, as the regions of Lower and Upper Egypt were in conflict for centuries, until Narmer subjugated the north and also established his authority over the entire Nile Valley. Artifacts such as Narmer's palette, a weapon apple, inscriptions, seals, and ivory tablets paint Narmer as a ruthless warrior and depict him in action against his enemies. In Narmer's palette, we see him grabbing the enemy by the hair while holding a weapon mace to deliver the final blow. On the other side, prisoners are killed, and Narmer is represented in a victory procession. According to Manetau himself, Narmer led the army across the border and conquered great glory, possibly positioning his incursions as far as Palestine, as suggested by several palaces bearing his name found in southern Israel. After unifying and ruling Egypt for years, Narmer met his death in an unusual way. According to historians, Narmer was killed by a hippopotamus during a hunt. The image of Egyptian kings in battle with these great creatures was very common and symbolized bravery and power. Although later pharaohs did not participate in these hunts, it is quite likely that the first kings needed to prove their worth through these activities, thus gaining the support and admiration of their subjects. Manetau's record about Pharaoh Narmer ends with the following sentence: "He was taken by a hippopotamus and died." And so ended the story of Narmer, probably the most important of all pharaohs.